Okay, so guys, first off, I just want to say that I'm not making this video to troll anyone or to offend anyone, and if I do, I'm sorry. That's not my intention at all. I just think this is an important discussion that needs to be had. So let's begin by defining our terms. Atheism, there's some disagreement about this online, but for the purposes of this video, atheism is simply the absence of belief in any God. And so by that definition, I'm an atheist. I don't believe there is a God. I don't believe there is not a God. Anti-theism is the opposition of belief in God. And this is when you don't want someone else to be a theist. Now, at first glance, it's like, well, who would hold that belief? Well, there's actually plenty of people who have explicitly said that. But then there's a lot of underlying hints of that, and we'll get to those later on. But those are the definitions we're going with, and in asking the question, can anti-theism be justified? I'm gonna be arguing that it requires showing that theism is false, or at least probably false. But first off, is theism or religion harmful? Keep in mind, this wouldn't justify anti-theism anyway, and the reason I say that is because if we say that, like tomorrow we all learned that there's a God, okay? We wouldn't say that we can't believe it because it's a harmful belief. We would simply we would accept the belief, we would acknowledge the belief is true, and then we would work to diminish the harm that comes from that acknowledgement. But as it turns out, there's no evidence that religion is harmful in and of itself. Most religious people do not seem to be harmed by or harmful because of religion. If you think of it in terms of like a scientific experiment, right? Think of religion as a substance. And if you conclude at the end of the experiment that most of the people exposed to this substance, they're not harmed, and they're not violent or intolerant, anything like that, then if you concluded from that religion is harmful, you'd be laughed out of the laboratory. Now, usually when an anti-theist is asked to defend the contention that religion is harmful, they end up appealing to the availability heuristic. And now, what is that? That is the view that because a certain result is more easily accessible in your mind, that means that it's more common than it really is. So, for example, like, you might go to the beach and you might be afraid of a shark attack, even though those are rare. You might go on a plane ride and be afraid of a plane crash because it's just such a dramatic image in your mind. It's easy to remember, even though you're more likely to die on the way to the airport in your car, that kind of thing. And so when anti-theists present it, it's usually, well, think of the Inquisition, think of the Crusades, things like that. And we need to point out to each other and everyone really that this is it's not a good way to do logic. These are minority instances, and it's not representative of what happens from religion overall, or usually. So, when we come to the question of what's true, am I just shifting the burden of proof, right? No, absolutely not. I think that if a Christian comes to you, or any other theist comes to you and says, look, there is a God, you're well within your rights to challenge them to support that claim. Now, we want to be charitable. If an atheist says there is no God, or if a theist says there is a God, we can and probably should ask, are you making that as a truth claim, or are you just saying what you believe? Because I think if you're just saying what you believe, that's different. But the other point is that it's not always just one side of an argument that has a burden of proof. A lot of times both sides will make claims that they need to back up. And so atheists are not special. We can fall to that same exact trap if we make a claim. Let's talk a bit about hidden claims. God is a delusion. He's an imaginary friend. Theism conflicts with reality, reason, etc., etc. To say God is a delusion, for example, a delusion is a false belief. Some people don't know that, but if you say that a Christian is delusory, you're saying they hold a belief that's false, and you can be challenged to support that claim. Saying he's an imaginary friend, same kind of thing. Like I've heard a lot of people use the example or try to compare belief in God with belief in Santa Claus. This is kind of a big thing that people do. And the problem is, well, really quickly, absence of evidence is only evidence of absence. In the event that if the proposition were true, we should expect to see more evidence than we have. So, when it comes to Santa Claus, for example, if Santa Claus were real, we should expect to have seen Santa captured on video, if not literally, or shot. Something like that would have happened. Now, you can say, well, maybe Santa Claus is invisible. But this would be an ad hoc, that is to say, contrived explanation just to win, just for the sole purposes of winning a religious debate. By contrast, God has always been conceptualized as an invisible being, so it's quite different. All right, so I think we've chosen scientists and comedians as our leaders on this topic, and I think that's a mistake. To be fair, Richard Dawkins here does have a doctorate in philosophy, but what standpoint are anti-theists usually coming from? That's the question. So, comedians, it's a little bit easy because you could just say, I've always said that when a comedian wants to make a political point, talk about politics, talk about religion, talk about morality, the appropriate response is to laugh at them. They're comedians. Their whole thing is to be entertaining, to be funny. And so it's not. We can't assume that they've given any serious thought to this. Scientists, a little bit different, but kind of the same idea. Scientists usually approach the topic of God from a scientific perspective. So they'll say things like, if there's no scientific evidence, no empirical evidence, then there's no reason to believe. And that just doesn't follow. That's philosophically naive to think that. And we need to approach these from more nuanced perspectives. This quote was by a very well-known anti-theist, but I'll leave it to you to guess who it is, or you can Google it. But it's important in emphasizing my point. You can't tell anything else about me. If that's true, if an atheist is simply someone who does not have a belief in God, then we can't say later on that, an atheist is someone that, by reasoning and logic and science, they've concluded, they've looked at the evidence and then determined that there's no God. That's not necessarily the case. There have been plenty. I've talked to plenty of atheists who believe there's no God or what have you for very illogical reasons. And so, in the same way that a Christian can believe in a God for a silly reason, atheists can reject it for a silly reason or believe the opposite for a silly reason. It's important to keep that in mind as well. Now, I will concede that religious people have dominated in the realm of intolerance throughout history, but I think this is due to power, and that anti-theists are inclined to make the same mistake. Why do I think that? Well, it comes back down to science. There have been some scientific studies, I'm thinking of like the Milgram experiment, the Zimbardo prison study, that have shown that absent religion as any kind of factor, the need to conform, the lust for power, these things can affect, or just being given power, can affect your behavior in really bad ways. And again, these studies don't mention religion at all. So we have more scientific evidence to say that maybe it's the fact that Christians and other theists have been in charge of so many of these societies that it's just been unchecked power. And I think that we should kind of oppose that either way. And we need to keep in mind that when it comes to religious intolerance, you don't have to be a theist to be guilty of religious intolerance. In fact, I'd say that anti-theism is by definition the intolerance of theistic religion. So let's be fair. This didn't just happen. This is a response to certain things that theists have done wrong. It's not an excuse, but it's an explanation. So I wanted to include this because a lot of times when I'm talking to anti-theists in like the comments section of any given video, they'll bring up their childhood or how they were treated wrongly by the church, things like that. I think that it's fair to say that a lot of the misconceptions about religion come from Christians themselves. and it's basically not practicing what you preach. You preach that you're a follower of Christ and that he taught love and all that, and then you don't show it. So this is not just reason for someone to reject religion, but for someone to oppose it. And so I think we need to be careful. In the same way, basically, I think both parties need to kind of check their extremist. So if you're more of a moderate, I think most of us are more moderate in our beliefs and our stances. We need to check our extremists. Now, Christians have done fairly well with things like the Westboro Baptist Church, but then they've also failed miserably when it comes to like Catholic priests. That's no secret. And so more could be done. At the same time, the reason I'm making this video is I think more can be done regarding anti-theists, because I haven't seen a lot of videos of atheists calling anti-theists out. And I think there should be more of that. But we need to at least graduate from awful anti-theistic arguments. We need to move up. A couple examples of these kind of arguments would be the problem of evil and the Euthyphro dilemma. The problem of both of these really are just they're questions. They're not even arguments. The problem of evil argument says it asked why or how could a all-loving, all-powerful God allow suffering and evil. And that's a good question, but it is just a question. And the implied premise there, the hidden premise, is that God could not have morally sufficient reasons for allowing suffering or evil. But this is an anti-theistic argument. I know that Christians sometimes make the mistake of trying to argue that God does have morally sufficient reasons, but they need to realize that that doesn't fall to them unless they just take that, unless they make that claim. They don't have to prove it. It falls to the anti-theist to show that God couldn't have morally sufficient reasons, or probably doesn't. Same thing with the Euthyphro dilemma. It's a question. It's saying, does God is something right because God wills it, or does God will it because it's right? Does he arbitrarily choose what is right and wrong, or does he look to something outside of himself to determine what's right and wrong? And I think that, as Christian apologist William Lane Craig has pointed out, this is a false dilemma. There could be a third option. For example, God could be what Plato called the good, and God's commands are just expressions of his moral nature, that is goodness itself. These are like the two names for the same thing. And so this is enough to show that the Euthyphro is a false dilemma. These are not serious arguments. These are really embarrassing arguments. I wish anti-theists would get rid of. Okay, so as you might have anticipated, I'm calling for everyone to get along. That's pretty much the idea. I'm not saying we have to agree. I think disagreeing is healthy, but it needs to be in a way that we really check our logic. We don't make claims we can't support. We don't oppose things we can't show are probably false, probably invalid. It just takes a little bit more humility than what I'm seeing. And I know the internet is not the place to look for humility, but it needs to become that, in my opinion. But if you agree or disagree with any, especially if you disagree, please leave a comment. Let me know. Maybe I'll do a video in response. Or if there's anything else you'd like for me to weigh in on, I might study up and make a video on that too. But in any case, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen. And until next time, everybody have a good day.